It's alive and it's already here. We won't save the Earth, but we can leave a warning. If you hear this, you must warn others. It's over, but only for us.
It began as an anomaly, an indecipherable signal buried in the noise of deep space monitoring systems. Astronomers at the Arecibo Observatory, hastily repaired after years of neglect, were the first to detect it. The signal, pulsating in a strange rhythm, seemed to come from nowhere. It was dismissed initially as interference or a cosmic coincidence, but over the following days it grew clearer, stronger, and impossible to ignore. Dr. Adrian Weiss, a renowned astrophysicist, was the first to decode its patterns. As he stared at the lines of data on his monitor, a chill crept down his spine. The signal wasn't just random. It carried information, coordinates, trajectories. And then, in a language painstakingly pieced together, a single horrifying message: prepare for judgment. The signal pinpointed an asteroid, an immense mass of rock and metal, hurtling through the void at an impossible speed. Its trajectory was precise, a collision course with Earth locked into inevitability. What sent it and why was unclear. But as more data poured in, it became evident that the asteroid was unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. Radioactive signatures emanated from its core, and infrared scans revealed strange, pulsating patterns on its surface, movements that hinted at life. The discovery was released to the public with cautious optimism by government agencies, downplaying the threat to avoid panic. But in an age of instant communication and relentless speculation, fear took root. News stations ran endless loops of simulated impact scenarios. Social media filled with conspiracy theories, doomsday prophecies, and outright denial. Amid the cacophony, the world learned its deadline: 6 months. The asteroid, now named Charybdis after the mythical sea monster, would strike in just half a year. Maria Calderon sat in her cramped apartment in Mexico City when the news broke, the glow of her laptop illuminating her face. The air outside buzzed with distant sounds of protest and celebration, an odd mix of reactions from a population unmoored by uncertainty. Maria, once a rising star in environmental science, had turned to activism after being disillusioned by corporate corruption and governmental inaction. Her organization, Earthbound Alliance, had spent years fighting to mitigate climate disasters, but now all those battles seemed meaningless. What was the point of saving a dying planet when annihilation loomed on the horizon? Still, something about the asteroid nagged at her. She spent sleepless nights poring over reports and digging into data leaked by whistleblowers. The more she read, the less it seemed like a natural phenomenon. The strange pulses recorded by satellites, the exactness of its trajectory, and then the chilling discovery that pieces of Charybdis were already breaking off, hurtling toward Earth like precursors of doom. The first fragment struck the Pacific Ocean 2 weeks later. What should have been a localized disaster, a tsunami, loss of marine life, became something far worse. Reports from nearby islands were fragmented and frantic. Survivors described sickening transformations, their neighbors and family members turning into horrors beyond comprehension. Skins sloughed off, bones warped and twisted, and voices became alien, speaking in tongues that no one could understand. Those who fled described the air thick with a fine, shimmering dust that clung to their skin, seeping into their pores. Maria's instincts screamed that these events were connected, but official channels remained silent, dismissing the accounts as hysteria or hallucinations. The world was teetering on the edge of chaos, and no one seemed willing to confront the growing evidence that Charybdis was more than a mere asteroid. It was alive, and it had already begun to feed. Desperation forced Maria to take action. She gathered her fragmented network of activists, scientists, and rogue technologists, pulling together what resources they had to launch an independent investigation. But it wasn't enough. Governments blocked access to crucial data, and her attempts to reach out to international leaders were met with silence or thinly veiled threats. Still, her small group persisted, collecting fragments of information from the ruins of the Pacific Strike and piecing together the horrifying truth. The asteroid was no accident. It was a weapon, a biological seed sent by an alien intelligence. Maria's team found evidence of complex cellular structures within the dust samples, organisms designed to infiltrate and mutate anything they touched. The horrifying realization hit her as she stared at a spore cluster under a microscope. This wasn't just about destruction, it was an invasion. As the weeks passed, more fragments struck Earth, each one leaving devastation in its wake. Entire regions went dark, their populations consumed by the alien contagion. Governments crumbled under the weight of panic and disinformation. Religious leaders declared the end times. Corporations abandoned their pledges for sustainability in favor of exploiting the crisis. And survivalists dug in, hoarding resources while humanity fell apart. Maria stood in the middle of it all, watching the world burn and knowing the clock was still ticking. She didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing. If humanity couldn't unite against this threat, there would be no one left to save. The alien weapon was more than a hammer. It was a mirror showing humanity its fractures and flaws, and those cracks were widening with every passing day. The world spiraled into pandemonium as Charybdis drew closer. The media churned out conflicting reports, some detailing plans of intervention, others proclaiming doom. Politicians issued hollow reassurances that sounded increasingly like funeral orations. Across the globe, the fragile veneer of order cracked, replaced by desperation, anger, and fear. Riots erupted in major cities as supplies dwindled. Nations closed borders, hoarding resources under the pretense of defense. Humanity was no longer fighting the asteroid. It was fighting itself. Maria Calderon watched the chaos unfold from a makeshift command center in a repurposed warehouse on the outskirts of Bogota. Her group, Earthbound Alliance, had grown exponentially in the last month, attracting disillusioned scientists, abandoned engineers, and everyday citizens searching for purpose in the madness. But with the influx came tensions. Refugees fleeing from areas hit by Charybdis fragments brought harrowing stories. Entire families consumed by alien spores. Cities reduced to breeding grounds for twisted alien forms. The fear was palpable, and not everyone trusted Maria's leadership. One evening, a video surfaced online, shared by a survivor of the Okinawa strike. It showed people convulsing as the spores took hold, their bodies contorting in ways that defied natural biology. Skin stretched and split, revealing glistening alien tissue beneath. Eyeballs darkened, then expanded, grotesquely transforming into multifaceted orbs. The infected screamed, not in pain, but in sounds that were unmistakably inhuman. When the video abruptly cut off, Maria realized it wasn't an isolated event. The same horrors had been reported in Lagos, Rio, and parts of Australia. Maria's team worked day and night to understand the biology of the spores. Samples were smuggled in from quarantine zones at great risk, each one more horrifying than the last. The spores acted as a catalyst, rewriting DNA with surgical precision to create hybrids that served a singular purpose: spreading the alien contagion. It was no longer just an asteroid. It was an ecosystem, a self-replicating, evolving nightmare. The tension in the warehouse boiled over when dissenters began questioning Maria's focus on science. "What's the point?" one man shouted during a meeting. He was a former chemical engineer, his face gaunt from weeks of stress. "We can't stop it. Look at what's happening out there. The governments aren't even trying anymore." Maria stood her ground, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "If we give in to fear, we've already lost. Every answer we find is another step towards survival. That's the fight we're in." Her words carried weight, but cracks in the group were becoming harder to mend. Outside, rumors of salvation spread like wildfire. Cults sprang up, worshipping Charybdis as a divine reckoning. Others claimed governments were hiding secret bunkers for the elite, sparking violent uprisings against any perceived authority. Maria's team was bombarded with misinformation, forcing them to sift through noise for any shred of actionable intelligence. Then came the event that changed everything. A fragment of Charybdis struck the eastern seaboard of the United States, just outside New York City. The explosion leveled entire boroughs, but the true horror lay in what came after. Satellite imagery revealed vast organic structures growing from the impact site, alien spires that twisted into the sky like grotesque towers of flesh and bone. They pulsed with an eerie bioluminescence, emitting signals that scrambled communications and amplified the chaos. Maria stared at the images in horror. "It's building something," she whispered. The room fell silent. No one needed to ask what it was. The asteroid wasn't just alive. It was intelligent, orchestrating its own invasion from millions of kilometers away. Despite the mounting dread, Maria clung to a sliver of hope. Her team's research into the spore biology had uncovered a weakness. The hybrids relied on a hive mind connection to function. Severing that connection might slow the spread. But implementing a solution required cooperation on a global scale, something increasingly out of reach as nations turned inward. Maria reached out to other activist networks, coordinating clandestine meetings and risking everything to share information. But the fragmented response from world powers was painfully clear. Some nations viewed Charybdis as a means to reset the global order, refusing to cooperate in hopes that their enemies would fall first. Others simply dissolved into anarchy, their governments collapsing under the weight of panic. As the asteroid loomed larger in the night sky, its surface now visible to the naked eye, humanity's desperation reached a breaking point. Broadcasts showed streets littered with makeshift altars to Charybdis, people kneeling in worship or begging for mercy. Militaries deployed futile strikes against alien growths, their weapons having little effect against the adaptive biology of the spires. The infected hybrids, once confined to impact zones, began appearing farther afield, suggesting a level of coordination that no one had anticipated. One night, Maria stood alone on the roof of the warehouse, staring at the sky. The stars seemed dimmer, their light eclipsed by the malevolent glow of Charybdis. She felt the weight of the world's fate pressing down on her, an unbearable burden she hadn't asked for but couldn't abandon. Her thoughts were interrupted by a low, rumbling sound. She turned to see distant lights on the horizon, fires raging in Bogota as riots consumed the city. Somewhere in the distance, screams echoed, but they weren't entirely human. The hybrids had arrived. Maria clenched her fists, swallowing the rising panic in her chest. She knew there was no saving everyone. But if she could buy humanity time, just enough to find a solution, it might be enough. That fragile hope was all she had left as the world descended into chaos. The launch felt like a funeral procession. The shuttle, a patchwork of scavenged technology and repurposed military hardware, rattled violently as it ascended through Earth's atmosphere. Every creak of metal sent a shiver through Maria Calderon's body, but fear of the ship breaking apart was the least of her concerns. She looked at the faces of the crew strapped in around her, a grim collection of scientists, engineers, and soldiers, all sharing the same haunted look. They had no illusions about their odds of survival. Maria adjusted her oxygen mask, the muffled hiss of her breath, a reminder of the fragile barrier between life and the void. Through the tiny porthole next to her, Charybdis loomed like a malignant tumor in the darkness, its surface writhing with organic movement. The asteroid was no longer just an alien construct. It was a living, breathing entity, and they were about to invade it. The team had dubbed the mission Operation Spearhead. The goal was simple in theory, but suicidal in practice. Infiltrate the asteroid, locate its core, and deploy a biological disruption device designed to sever its hive mind network. The device was an experimental creation, hastily developed from the research Maria's team had pieced together. It was untested, but there was no time for trials. The world was out of time. The shuttle shuddered as it drew closer to Charybdis. From this proximity, its surface was a landscape of horrors, vast ridges of bone-like structures, valleys of pulsating flesh, and clusters of spore-filled pods that opened and closed like breathing lungs. As the ship approached what appeared to be a cavernous opening near the asteroid's equator, Maria felt an unnatural pull. Instruments on the shuttle blinked and failed, the navigational systems overwhelmed by the electromagnetic interference emanating from the alien surface. "Manual control engaged," called out Lieutenant Hayes, the shuttle pilot. His knuckles were white as he gripped the controls, steering them into the gaping maw of the asteroid. The entrance was lined with jagged fang-like structures, and as the shuttle passed through, Maria could swear she felt the asteroid itself react. its walls contracting slightly as though it were swallowing them whole. Inside, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the flickering lights of the shuttle. The walls of the tunnel were moist and alive, pulsating rhythmically as if synced to an immense heartbeat. Every so often, something slithered past the edges of the lights, a flash of translucent limbs or the glimmer of reflective eyes. The crew worked in tense silence, their movements slow and deliberate. Any sound felt like a violation in this suffocating organic labyrinth. "Deploying beacon," said Dr. Singh, the mission's lead biologist. The small glowing device was released from the shuttle, its signal cutting through the interference to transmit data back to Earth. Maria knew the chances of anyone on the surface being able to use the data were slim, but they had to try. The shuttle finally came to a halt in a vast chamber deep within the asteroid. The walls were lined with what looked like veins, glowing faintly with an otherworldly green light. At the center of the chamber was a towering structure that resembled a chrysalis, its surface shifting and writhing as if something inside were trying to break free. Maria felt a wave of nausea as she realized the truth. This was the heart of Charybdis, the source of its intelligence and the key to its invasion. "Suit up," she ordered, her voice steady despite the growing dread. The crew moved quickly, donning their armored suits and securing their weapons. The airlock hissed open, and the team stepped onto the fleshy ground. It was soft and wet, giving slightly under their boots, as if walking on a living organism. They moved as one, approaching the core with the device in tow. The disruption device was housed in a metal container the size of a small coffin, its interior filled with a volatile chemical cocktail designed to overwhelm the asteroid's neural network. The plan was to place it as close to the core as possible and trigger the detonation remotely. But Charybdis wasn't passive. As the team approached the core, the walls began to shift, tendrils emerging from the surfaces like grasping fingers. One of the soldiers fired instinctively, the sharp crack of the gunshot echoing through the chamber. The tendrils recoiled, but the walls responded with a low, guttural groan that vibrated through the ground. "They know we're here," whispered Dr. Singh, his voice trembling. Suddenly the chamber came alive. Creatures emerged from the walls and floors, twisted hybrids of human and alien, their bodies a grotesque amalgamation of stretched skin, exposed muscle, and spindly limbs. Their faces were almost recognizable, distorted into nightmarish parodies of the people they once were. The team opened fire, the sharp staccato of gunfire reverberating through the chamber. The creatures moved with terrifying speed, their movements erratic yet purposeful, as if guided by a single mind. Maria focused on the task at hand, shouting orders as the team fought to hold their ground. "Get the device to the core, now!" Two of the soldiers fell, their screams cutting short as the creatures overwhelmed them, tearing flesh from bone with impossible efficiency. Maria pushed forward, her hands trembling as she helped drag the device into position. The core pulsed violently, its surface splitting open to reveal a mass of shifting, glowing tendrils that seemed to writhe in time with the creature's movements. "Activate it!" she yelled, her voice hoarse. Dr. Singh moved to comply, but one of the creatures lunged at him, knocking him to the ground. Maria fired her weapon, the shot piercing the creature's skull. But it was too late. Singh's suit was torn open, and spores spilled into the air, quickly invading his body. He convulsed violently, his screams turning into guttural, alien howls. With no time to grieve, Maria activated the device herself. It began to hum, the sound growing louder as it charged. But before it could reach full power, the core reacted, sending out a massive wave of energy that knocked Maria and the remaining crew off their feet. The device flickered and went dark. Maria stared in horror as the core began to regenerate, its tendrils growing larger and more aggressive. The chamber was collapsing, the walls closing in as if the asteroid itself were digesting them. She scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. There was no escape, no way to fight back. As the creatures closed in, Maria's last thought was of Earth, of the people she had tried so desperately to save. Then the darkness consumed her. The sky was no longer the sky. It glowed with an alien hue, the stars drowned out by swirling patterns of green and violet light emanating from the spore clouds. They drifted like malevolent auroras, spreading across continents, blocking out the sun and casting an unnatural, sickly glow over the dying planet below. Earth's once familiar landscapes had been replaced by grotesque alien growths, towering spires of pulsating flesh and chitin, sprawling forests of tendrils that writhed as if alive, and lakes transformed into viscous pools of bioluminescent sludge. Humanity's last defenses had crumbled. The bunkers, the quarantines, the resistance movements, all consumed. The alien contagion had spread too quickly, adapting to every effort to contain it. Cities had become necropolises, their ruins teeming with hybrids. Roads were overgrown with alien vines, their roots splitting asphalt and consuming vehicles. There were no armies left, no governments, no coordinated plans, only scattered survivors huddled in the dark, waiting for the inevitable. Among them was 15-year-old Liam Devereaux, one of the few to escape the final collapse of New York City. He sat in the ruins of what had once been a subway station, the air around him thick with the metallic tang of spores. The others in his group, a motley collection of former students, workers, and soldiers, had fallen silent over the past days. The exhaustion in their eyes mirrored his own, a shared knowledge that their struggle was futile. There was nowhere left to run. Liam's fingers brushed against a small metal object in his pocket, a memory card scavenged from the remains of a crashed shuttle near the Hudson River. The word Earthbound was scrawled across it in faded marker, the letters almost smudged away by blood and ash. He didn't know who Maria Calderon was, but he'd heard whispers of her name, an activist, a leader, someone who had fought to the very end. They said her message might hold answers, or at least hope. Hope. The word felt hollow. Yet, as Liam stared into the darkness, he clung to it, as fragile and flickering as the light of the fire burning at his feet. Above ground, the spore clouds thickened, their tendrils snaking downward. The hybrids had begun their final push, moving in organized waves, not to destroy, but to assimilate. The air carried the faint hum of the hive mind, an eerie, synchronized resonance that seemed to burrow into the skulls of anyone still alive. Liam pressed his hands over his ears, but the sound was inside him, vibrating through his bones. He stood and glanced at the others. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice hoarse from days of breathing contaminated air. They didn't respond. Most were too far gone, their skin mottled with the early signs of infection. Some stared blankly ahead, their eyes glassy and unfocused. He knew they wouldn't follow him. Liam turned and climbed the broken staircase that led to the surface. The city above was unrecognizable. Alien structures rose where skyscrapers once stood, their twisted forms emitting a faint, wet, gurgling sound. The streets were lined with cocoons, each one pulsating faintly. Liam didn't want to know what was inside them. The hybrids moved in the distance, their figures blurred by the spore-laden air, their movements mechanical and deliberate. He kept moving, clutching the memory card like a talisman. The ruins of a broadcast tower loomed ahead, its skeletal frame covered in alien growths, but still standing. If there was any chance to send Maria's message to the world, or what was left of it, this was it. Reaching the tower, Liam climbed through the debris, his lungs burning with every breath. The alien growths clung to his hands and feet, their surfaces warm and sticky, as if alive. He reached the control panel, miraculously intact beneath layers of grime and spore residue. He slotted the memory card into a terminal and activated the power. The screen flickered to life, displaying a video file labeled Last Hope. Liam hit play. Maria's face appeared, gaunt and streaked with blood, her eyes weary but resolute. She spoke with urgency, her voice cracking but unwavering. "If you're hearing this, then we failed. Charybdis is here, and humanity is lost. But you need to know this. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a harvest." Her words were punctuated by the distant sound of gunfire and screams. "They sent Charybdis to strip us of everything, our resources, our biology, our individuality. This isn't the end for them. This is what they do. They will move on to another world, another species. We weren't the first, and we won't be the last." She paused, her breath hitching. "But we left them something. Inside this file is every piece of data we collected about the spores, the hybrids, their vulnerabilities. It's not enough to stop them here, but maybe someone else can. Another species, another civilization. If you survive, if you can escape this planet, take this with you. Don't let this happen again." The screen went dark. Liam stared at it, his hands trembling. The hum of the hive mind grew louder, vibrating through the tower. He turned and saw them, hybrids climbing the structure, their eyes reflecting the sickly green glow of the spores. They moved as one, their distorted faces devoid of emotion. Liam closed his eyes, Maria's final words echoing in his mind. There was no escape, no salvation, only the certainty that humanity's time had ended and something else had taken its place. He gripped the memory card tightly and whispered, "I'm sorry." The hybrids closed in, their movements relentless and precise. Above, the spore clouds swirled, casting the world in an eternal twilight, and in the distance the faint glow of Charybdis pulsed, a monstrous heart beating steadily in the sky. The earth was silent,